Hey guys, tonight we begin with the grim, dangerous, and deeply unglamorous world of medieval assassins. Not the sleek, hooded vigilantes from your favorite video game. Not the stylish murderers in films who leap off rooftops in slow motion. No, we're talking about the real thing. Those silent, desperate shadows who slipped through castle corridors and stank alleyways, changed history with a blade and a whisper, and likely died without anyone remembering their name. Before we get too cozy, hit the like button, maybe subscribe if you're into stories like these, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always love seeing the global chaos of sleep schedules. Okay, lights down, fan on, and let's get uncomfortable together. Let's make one thing painfully clear. No one in medieval Europe ever woke up and said, "You know what? I think I'd like to stab a baron in the liver for 12 silver coins and the joy of hiding in a bucket of dead fish for 3 days." Becoming an assassin wasn't a career path. It was what happened when life completely fell apart. This wasn't the life goal of someone raised in a candlelit dojo by monks with philosophical daggers. Most assassins weren't trained killers with mysterious backstories. They were failed everything else's, disgraced soldiers, destitute peasants, thieves who didn't run fast enough, or just people so far off the societal grid that they could stab someone in broad daylight and still not show up in the census. If you had money, you didn't do the killing. You hired someone. If you had land or even a goat, you were middle management. But if you just crawled out of debtor's prison, had a talent for climbing things without sneezing, and looked good in shadows, well, congratulations. Someone was about to slide a coin purse across a table and whisper a name into your ear. And that name? It wasn't Bob the friendly turnip vendor. It was usually a bishop sitting on too much gold, a noble with 12 bodyguards and an ego the size of his moat, or a military officer who made one too many enemies at the last banquet. The pay? Oh, it was tempting. Tempting enough to override all the screaming red flags. But the job itself? Absolutely horrifying. By the time anyone considered it, they had nothing left to lose. No home. No family, no future, no dental plan, just hunger, desperation, and the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, this job would be the one that bought a new life, or at least a warm cloak. Let's not romanticize it. There were no benefits, no union, no guild of professional assassins handing out leather boots and inspirational pamphlets. There were no evening hours off. You didn't get to clock out and enjoy some mulled wine by the fire. You couldn't put up a nice little sign that read, "Eliminations available by appointment, cash only." There were no calling cards, no cool aliases, just silence. Always silence. Move fast, disappear faster, and never, ever explain what you do for a living, especially not while drunk in a crowded tavern. Oh yeah. I'm a traveling fur merchant. That red on my sleeves? Die. Definitely die. So let's just burst that bubble right now. Nobody ever wanted to be a medieval assassin. They ended up there, spat out by a world that didn't care, wrapped in rags, gripping a stolen dagger, and praying no one asked too many questions. They weren't heroes. They weren't even villains. They were footnotes. The kind that made people uneasy and didn't live long enough to enjoy the coin they risked everything to earn. Because here's the secret no one tells you. Being a shadow in a cruel world doesn't make you powerful. It makes you disposable. And no one writes songs for the disposable. Let's go ahead and tear down myth number 1. Medieval assassins did not train by candlelight in some mystical mountaintop monastery, guided by a blind mentor whispering philosophical wisdom and sharpening their souls with flute music in the background. There were no montages, No secret brotherhood rituals. No opening speech that went, "You must become the blade." If you learned anything at all in this profession, it was because you didn't die the first few times you tried. That was the whole training program. Step 1, survive. Step 2, repeat until you don't. Most assassins weren't professionals. They were desperate amateurs who happened to be quiet, had decent balance, and didn't sneeze at inopportune moments. If you were lucky enough to have military experience, great. You at least knew which end of a dagger went into a person. If not, well, stabbing someone is tragically pretty self-explanatory. It's escaping afterward with your organs still internal that takes talent, or dumb luck. Usually both. There were no handbooks, no instructors, no guild orientation sessions with slideshows on how to spot a decoy, or castle windows a field guide. You didn't learn the layout of noble households from blueprints. You figured it out while hanging from a ledge, praying the room you were about to enter wasn't full of guards or pigs. Sometimes it was pigs. Pigs scream. Poison? That wasn't some precise alchemical art. That was trial and error, with a heavy emphasis on error. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it made your target a bit dizzy and just more suspicious of his stew. And sometimes you drank the wrong cup. There was no medieval poison control hotline, no friendly herbalist on standby, just a handful of roots, a vague memory of what might be deadly, and a stomach built to withstand regret. Sure, if the stars aligned and you won the medieval lottery, you might have picked up a tip or two from an old thief or mercenary. Maybe some half-retired killer showed you how to walk without squeaking on wet cobblestones. But that was rare, and always temporary, because assassins didn't train protégés. They didn't take on apprentices. They didn't retire. They disappeared, preferably before anyone else noticed they were still breathing. Weapons training? Forget it. You weren't strutting around with a gleaming longsword or a custom-forged katana. You had a dagger that used to belong to a guard, one you probably had to kill to get. Maybe, if you were feeling especially fancy, a garrote made from horsehair and resentment, and whatever else you could shove into your boots without jingling when you walked. You weren't a shadowy martial arts master. You were a half-starved scavenger with calloused hands, good ears, and an anxiety disorder that doubled as a survival skill. Success wasn't about form. It wasn't about discipline. It was about speed, improvisation, and a total lack of hesitation. You killed quickly, sloppily, and disappeared before anyone could sketch your face or yell, "Hey!" Your education came in bruises. Your diploma was a set of bloodstains you didn't leave behind, and the only ceremony you ever got was surviving long enough to do it again. So no, assassins weren't crafted, they were cornered. And the only real lesson they learned was this: if you're lucky enough to live through it, you're unlucky enough to do it again. So you've taken the job, or more accurately, the job took you. Someone whispered a name in a smoky tavern, slid a purse across the table, and suddenly you were part of something much bigger and far more suicidal than you expected. Because let's be clear, nobody hires an assassin for small problems. Nobody needs someone eliminated because Jeff the beekeeper was charging too much for honey. Number: you're brought in when things are already on fire, politically, socially, theologically, and someone's ready to pay in silver just to make one body disappear before dawn. Let's talk about that silver. Cold, heavy, clinking silver. It's always the bait. It's what gets you in the room. The jingle in the pouch is louder than the alarm bells in your head. They'll offer half now, half later. Always half now, half later. And you, desperate, cold, broke, nod like it's a fair trade. But here's the actual translation of half later. We'll pay the rest if you don't screw this up, don't leave a trail, don't make us look bad, and especially if you don't survive long enough to tell anyone we were involved. That second half, it's the assassin's version of a fairy tale. Because when you do make it back, bloody, exhausted, maybe minus a toe, and sit down expecting your reward, your client is already gone, disappeared, fled the city. So sorry, he left in the night. Terrible business, nothing to be done. If you're lucky, if you're not lucky, someone stabs you in the gut as you're knocking on the door, because a knife costs less than a payout. And even when you do get paid, it's never quite enough. Not for the weeks of stalking, bribing, waiting in cellars, hiding in sewage, dodging guards, or memorizing patrol schedules while pretending to be a mute stable boy with ringworm. Not for the mental toll, the smell, or the 3 days you spent hiding in a haystack with nothing but fleas and remorse. You get a handful of greasy coins, a curt nod, and a reminder, you were never here. And here's the extra fun. Some contracts weren't even real. Political traps. You get told to eliminate a high-value target, only to discover it's a decoy surrounded by guards expecting an intruder. You kick in the wrong door and boom, you're in a sting. Your name's already scratched into the gallows plank, right under traitor and just above idiot. There's no safety net, no appeal. You can't exactly walk into a magistrate's chamber and say, Your Honor, I'd like to file a formal complaint. My employer failed to uphold the agreed-upon terms of the murder-for-hire contract. The only court you'll be visiting is the one where the judge already knows which rope fits your neck best. So, what do you learn? Fast. You learn that trust is the deadliest thing you can carry. You take the money up front, all of it. You don't trust the scribe with shaky hands. You don't trust the noblewoman who looks too calm. You especially don't trust the merchant with perfect teeth who says, this job could change your life. Because he's right, it will. Just not how you think. And never forget. Some of them plan to kill you the moment the job is done, not because you failed, because you succeeded. You now know too much. You know who wanted who dead, why, when, and how. That makes you a loose end. And loose ends in medieval politics don't get severance packages. They get silenced. So, you do the job. You vanish. And you stay gone. You change your name. You dye your cloak. You leave no forwarding address. Because in this business, disappearing is your only promotion. Being a medieval assassin didn't mean glory. It meant survival, skepticism, and never sitting with your back to the door. You lived on promises that snapped under pressure. You learned that a coin purse wasn't payment, it was bait. And every contract came with a bonus clause, betrayal. Let's talk gear. Forget everything the fantasy novels and sneaky video games promised. There were no retractable wrist blades, no smoke bombs tucked into your belt, no enchanted daggers blessed by moonlight, and absolutely no crossbows that folded neatly into your boot like some medieval Swiss Army knife. Your toolkit, if it could even be called that, was whatever you could steal, sharpen, or shove under your cloak without rattling like a bag of bones. If you were lucky, and I mean found a gold coin in a dead man's shoe lucky, you might have had a decent dagger. Not curved like a dragon's fang, not forged by elven smiths, just sharp, hopefully rust-free, and ideally one that didn't smell like the last guy you used it on. It wasn't a badge of honor. It was just a tool, one you cleaned quickly and hid faster. Poison? Oh, it existed. Sure, but it wasn't the elegant theatrical sort you see in stage plays, no slow drips into goblets, no delicate flasks with skull insignias. It was roots, mushrooms, minerals, maybe the occasional toad. You scraped together a mixture based on herbal guesswork, local superstition, and the unsettling advice of someone who once poisoned their stepfather's stew and now had a weird twitch. Half the time, it just made your target nauseous. The other half? They vomited for 2 days and survived angrier and more suspicious than ever. And sometimes, you poisoned yourself. Oops. Ropes. Sometimes useful. You could strangle, scale walls, or tie up something that wasn't fighting back too hard, but you'd better move fast because nothing says incompetent like fumbling your knots mid-suffocation while muttering, "Wait, is it rabbit through the hole or rabbit around the tree?" Bows. Effective, if you had one, knew how to shoot it, and weren't trying to sneak it through a palace disguised as a flower arranger. Most assassinations didn't allow for graceful archery poses under moonlight. They were up close, chaotic, fast, blink and miss it kind of violence. There was no room for elegance, no audience clapping when you pulled it off. And backups? What backups? If your blade broke, bent, or fell into a latrine mid-job, that was it. Time to get creative. Slate roof tile? Sure. Rusty nail? Worth a shot. Shoe buckle with confidence? That's called improvisation. Because in this line of work, you didn't have options. You had desperation. Every weapon had to be hidden. In boots, hems, sleeves, maybe even baked into a hollowed-out loaf of bread. And you kept them close. Not for safety. For survival. Your weapon wasn't your sidekick. It was your plan A, B, and C. It was your one friend in a world full of people who would gladly hang you for owning it. There were no upgrades. No tinkerers ready to improve your gear between contracts. No cozy montage where you polish your blades before the next mission. If your dagger chipped, you cursed. If it snapped, you ran. If it jammed halfway through someone's ribs, you prayed to gods you hadn't believed in since childhood and hoped your boots were laced tight. Because in the end, it wasn't the weapon that did the killing. It was you. Alone. Poorly equipped. Expected to perform miracles with whatever wasn't nailed down. You weren't walking into a job with a trunk full of elite gadgets. You were crawling through a side window with a kitchen knife wrapped in cheesecloth, hoping no one noticed the blood on your socks. So yes, the myths got it wrong again. You weren't the shadowy figure blessed with arcane steel and divine favor. You were a bundle of nerves, sweat, and rust. And the only thing magical about your kit was that it hadn't gotten you killed. Yet. Let's get one thing out of the way. Nobody hired assassins to deal with village drunks or candle makers who forgot to pay their taxes. You weren't being paid to stab Jeff the Sleepy Chandler because he borrowed someone's donkey and didn't return it. Assassins were brought in when things were already tangled in blood, power, and secrets. Your target? Always important. Always dangerous. Always surrounded by enough steel and suspicion to make your job feel like storming a fortress barefoot. We're talking nobles with titles longer than your resume. Bishops with more gold than God. Military officers who didn't just wear armor, they slept in it. Sometimes, if you were especially unlucky, it was royalty. And royalty didn't just sit around waiting to get stabbed. Let's start with the obvious. Guards. Not one or two. Dozens. Maybe more. Well-fed, well-armed, and bored out of their skulls, which made them extra eager to bash someone's face in if they so much as looked shifty. There were guards at the front. Guards at the back. Guards who guarded other guards. Some stood still like statues. Some paced like angry dogs. Some stared at you like they knew your mother lied on the census, and all of them existed to ruin your night. So you watched. For days, sometimes weeks, you memorized patrol patterns, counted the steps between torch posts. noted which knight wheezed after 3 flights of stairs and which one always got distracted by the kitchen maid. You studied the rhythm of a building like it was a living thing, because it was. And then there were the walls. Castles didn't have welcoming front porches or polite side gates. They had fortresses of stone, towers designed to break bones, murder holes that did exactly what the name suggests, and moats filled with things that like to bite. Even if you made it past the outer perimeter, there were arrow slits to worry about, narrow gaps in the stone, perfectly sized for putting a bolt through your neck if someone sneezed at the wrong time. And yes, boiling oil was a thing. That's not just a bedtime story to scare apprentices. It was real. If you so much as peeked through the wrong window, someone up top might decide to turn you into fried regret. But the guards and walls weren't even the worst part. The real nightmare? The staff, cooks, scribes, stable boys, chambermaids. These people saw everything. They didn't wear armor, but they knew who was supposed to be where. One wrong move, one awkward stare, one moment fumbling with a chamber pot. And suddenly, the stable boy is whispering to the captain of the guard that someone's new. Medieval gossip traveled faster than light if it meant someone could earn a favor or keep their head. You weren't just fighting swords. You were fighting rumor, the kind of whisper that could get you skewered before dessert. And then, the target. Paranoid didn't even begin to describe them. They didn't eat without a taster. They didn't sleep without a tester. They locked their doors 3 times and switched bedrooms every night like royalty playing hide-and-seek with death. Some used decoy beds. Others slept in towers guarded by their cousin's loyal dog. Even attending a feast didn't make them vulnerable. Sure, they were drinking. But so were you, and you still had to get past the royal guards, 2 mastiffs trained to bite first and sniff later, a jester who didn't miss anything, and 50 drunken nobles who'd love to call for your head just for sport. Getting close wasn't a matter of luck, it was endurance. You posed as a servant, you bribed a chambermaid, you crouched in wine barrels, hay piles, cupboards. You waited and waited and waited until the right moment. And when that moment came, you had one shot, no do-overs, no second tries, one precise, bloodless, silent opportunity to strike and vanish before someone shouted, "Wait, who the hell is that?" Because if you missed, if you hesitated, if you slipped on a rug or the target turned just as your hand moved, then congratulations, you were the next public warning, swinging from a gate with a sign that read, "Nice try." Let's talk about disguises. Because if you're picturing sleek black robes, perfectly tailored leather bracers, and a dramatic hood billowing in the moonlight, you've clearly read too many fantasy novels. The reality? You looked like a sick goat herder with a hygiene problem and something sketchy under your cloak. Being a medieval assassin didn't mean looking cool. It meant looking like someone no one wanted to talk to. Disguises in the Middle Ages weren't elegant. They were pitiful. You didn't get made-to-measure cloaks or armor that folded into itself. You got what you could steal off a washing line or trade for stale bread. Sometimes it was peasant rags. Other times it was a monk's robe that smelled like fermented despair. And if you were lucky, maybe the scorched remains of a guard uniform, complete with bloodstains that definitely didn't match your story. The whole point was to blend in, but blending in meant looking miserable. And not just regular miserable, authentically miserable. Like someone who hadn't bathed in 2 weeks, had scabies, and twitched whenever someone said taxes. You didn't raise suspicion with your outfit. You raised suspicion by adjusting your belt too many times to hide the dagger wrapped in cheesecloth. And forget masks. This wasn't the Renaissance. You didn't have sleek, sculpted facial covers. You had cloth, dirty cloth, maybe a veil. But mostly, any attempt at covering your face made you look like a leper. And while that was great for keeping conversations short, it didn't exactly help you sneak into a noble's dinner party. If someone asked who you were, you had to think fast. I'm Brother Tobias. I take care of silent prayer and rooftop maintenance. Sure you do. The real problem wasn't the disguise. It was keeping it. Noble households weren't full of idiots. They knew their staff. A single, unfamiliar face stood out like a drunk nun at morning mass. And servants? They noticed everything. The way you held a tray, how you walked, whether you knew the cook's name, whether you could carry a chamber pot without gagging. You were always just one badly timed "who are you again?" away from getting clubbed with a candlestick by a suspicious butler. And even if your disguise did work, congratulations, you were now committed. That meant holding character for hours, maybe days, while surrounded by people who would absolutely report you if they noticed your hands were too clean or you didn't flinch at the smell of pig fat. And all while resisting the urge to stab everyone in the room for convenience. Wigs? Not a thing. Makeup? Dirt. Aging yourself? Also dirt. Most of your options for changing appearance boiled down to smear more filth on your face and squint a lot. Maybe glue a beard on with honey if you had time. But one strong breeze or an inquisitive goat, and your cover was gone. And even when everything did go perfectly, when you slipped past the guards, blended in with the staff, and crept your way to the target, your disguise only bought you 5 minutes. Tops. After that, it was your mouth, your posture, or your smell that gave you away. Because disguises didn't protect you. They bought you time. Time to move, to stab, to escape. Maybe, if you were lucky. And if anyone saw through it, well, no one wants to be the assassin caught in the bishop's laundry room wearing a nun's habit and holding a sword. Especially not on a feast day. Because that's not just failure, that's spectacle. In medieval times, if you were an assassin, you didn't have a team. You didn't have a partner with a crossbow, a wise old alchemist sending you coded scrolls, or a handler with a map and a safe house. There was no secret headquarters under a bakery. There was just you, a rusty blade, a fraying cloak, and the creeping realization that every face you passed might be the one that ends you. There were no guilds you could count on. Not really. Whispers, maybe. Tavern tales of shadowy brotherhoods where killers shared techniques and toasted over blood wine. But in reality, you were more likely to meet a ghost than another assassin willing to swap trade secrets. This wasn't a community. It was a cul-de-sac of paranoia. If there was a brotherhood, they didn't want to know you. Because in this profession, the fewer people who knew you existed, the longer you did. Every person you met was a risk. Every glance was a gamble. Even your client might not know your real name. That wasn't just smart, it was survival. And if someone did know your name, you were already planning how to vanish before they could say it out loud. Companionship? Laughable. Friends asked questions. Lovers noticed bruises, night terrors, and the fact you always slept with your back to the wall and a dagger under the blanket. You couldn't settle down, you couldn't relax, you couldn't trust. Not because of pride, because of math. One mistake, one person recognizing you in a market square, and your entire life collapsed into a sprint toward the nearest sewer entrance. Even other criminals avoided you. Thieves had friends, smugglers had crews. Assassins? You were the guy who made people disappear. Best case, They feared you. Worst case, they saw you as walking liability. No one wanted to share a stew with someone who could bring the constable, the clergy, and the royal guard to their door in the same night. And forget sympathy. You couldn't explain what you did. Couldn't unburden yourself. Couldn't tell the innkeeper's daughter that last night you strangled a bishop who prayed too loudly. If you talked, people either thought you were lying, or worse, telling the truth, and neither reaction ended well. So you stayed quiet, kept your scars to yourself. At inns, you picked the darkest corner, always facing the door. You drank just enough to blend in, never enough to forget. You never stayed more than a night, never gave your name unless someone paid for it. And even then, it probably wasn't your real one. Being an assassin wasn't just about killing. It was about vanishing from suspicion, from memory, from every version of a life you might have had if things had gone differently. No friends, no fame, no future. You walked through the world like a ghost in a borrowed coat. You didn't just hide from enemies. You hid from everything: belonging, comfort, vulnerability. You weren't a man anymore. You were a rumor, a whisper behind locked doors, a shadow that people avoided without knowing why, a presence that made the room colder. And the cruelest part, the better you got at it, the less human you became, because survival meant silence. It meant fading. It meant watching the world live around you while you stayed just far enough outside of it to never be recognized or mourned. It never took much to die in this business. Not some grand betrayal, not a legion of guards storming your hideout. Just a misstep, a sneeze, a patch of wet stone your boots didn't grip, a single knock at the wrong time. That was all it took for everything: the planning, the waiting, the whisper-thin thread of your life, to snap. You could spend days watching a fortress, mapping exits, memorizing patrol routes, learning which guard liked to flirt with the laundress and which one drank too much at supper. You could bribe the cook, time the bells, disguise yourself as a visiting monk with forged credentials and the perfect accent. And then, in the moment, when it mattered most, your foot caught the edge of a loose tile, or your target turned unexpectedly, or a dog barked and a sleepy sentry looked up at the exact wrong second. And that was it. There was no rewind, no second shot, no magical escape rope, just screaming steel in whatever part of your body hit the floor first. The punishment for failure wasn't a poor review. It was a public execution. You didn't just fail. You became an example. A message pinned to the town gates, sometimes literally. Your corpse on display, half dressed in whatever outfit you'd hoped would fool the guards. People would spit, laugh, or cross themselves depending on the weather. Children would point. Rats would feast. If you were caught alive, they made a show of it. You were paraded, beaten, interrogated in ways that stripped the word of its meaning. They wanted to know who hired you, what you knew, who else was involved, and if you said nothing, they got creative. Heat, blades, fire, rope, everything short of mercy. Even if you were lucky, and lucky is doing some heavy lifting here, and managed to escape, the stain never left. You'd be hunted. Your name, or whatever alias you'd used, would be passed through markets and taverns, and into the ears of men who liked catching shadows for coin. You became someone's payday. That was if you lived. Most didn't. Most died stupid, slipped on spilled wine, got spotted by a maid who didn't like your face, underestimated how loud floorboards creaked in winter, got distracted by the wrong scream. The work was never elegant. It was frantic, fast, messy, and even when everything went perfectly, even when the blade landed and the breath stopped, the danger didn't. You still had to get out. which meant retracing your steps through a building now on alert, through hallways echoing with alarm, past guards suddenly sober, sharp, and furious. You were bloodied, winded, and trying not to look like someone who just murdered a man of status. And if you made it outside, it wasn't over. There were horses to outrun, gates to breach, roads to vanish on. And if anyone saw your face, that was a new problem, because there were tapestries in some castles, artists who'd sketch your likeness before breakfast, and once your face made it onto a wanted scroll, good luck ever buying bread without a hood and a knife under the table. There was no celebration for a job half done, no nice try, no participation award. There was only death and the hope it wouldn't come tonight. Because in this profession, you could be perfect 100 times, but it only took one mistake to end as a stain on someone's courtyard stones. You weren't allowed to be clumsy, or tired, or human. And if you ever were, even for a moment, the ground was already opening beneath your feet. And then, sometimes, it worked. Sometimes, by some crooked miracle of timing and sweat and sheer stubborn will, you did it. The blade found its mark. The noble gasped. The room stayed silent long enough for you to slip back into the dark like you'd never been there. The dog didn't bark. The maid didn't scream. No one saw you. No one stopped you. And in that moment, that exact heartbeat-long moment, you felt it. Success. Not triumph. Not victory. Just the absence of failure. The absence of disaster. Like stepping through a field of bear traps and hearing none of them snap shut. And you didn't smile. You didn't cheer. You didn't breathe. Because now came the hard part. You had to get out. Not just out of the room. Not just out of the castle. Out of the city. Out of the memory of the place. Erase every footprint. Burn every bridge. Walk backward through the world until even the air stopped recognizing you. Sometimes that meant climbing out a window and dropping 30 feet into mud. Other times, it meant blending into the kitchen staff, praying no one noticed your cloak was slightly bloodier than regulation. Once, it meant crawling through a sewer so foul you hoped you'd get caught just so someone would pull you out. But you didn't stop. Couldn't. Because every second after the kill was a race against time, against luck, against anyone who might have seen a flicker of movement or remembered that the stable boy didn't have a limp yesterday. You didn't have time to savor the kill. No collecting trophies, no posing the body for dramatic effect. This wasn't theater. It was flight. Every step a gamble, every shadow a threat, every stranger a potential informant. And when, if, you made it beyond the walls, past the checkpoints and gossip and dogs with good noses, you didn't relax. You vanished. Different name, different city, different everything. Because someone, somewhere still wanted answers, still wanted revenge, and you weren't about to be found 2 weeks later, drunk in a tavern, bragging to a barmaid about the time you stabbed Lord What's-His-Face. Number, you kept moving. Success didn't buy freedom. It bought silence. It bought paranoia. It bought the right to keep your head down and maybe, not die this month. The client might pay up. They might not. They might try to kill you. They might already have sent someone else to follow you home. You never knew. That was part of the price. You didn't just sell your skills, you sold your certainty. And even when you got the money, the full amount, all in coin, slid across a table in a pouch that didn't jingle too loudly, it never felt like enough. It didn't pay for the bruises, the sleepless nights, the scars no one would ever see. It didn't cover the cost of who you'd become to survive. You couldn't go back to who you were. couldn't even remember who that was. The job had changed you, hardened you, hollowed you. And the worst part? No one would know. No ballads, no statues, no whispered legend of the one who slipped past every guard and silenced a tyrant. Just a footnote in a noble's obituary. Died suddenly, tragic, unexplained. And that was the point. That was your masterpiece, being invisible, being forgotten, because that's what success meant. No witnesses, no glory, just the knife, the silence, and the long walk into nowhere. You didn't just disappear. You had to disappear. Because if the job went well and word got out, people didn't celebrate you. They feared you. Not in the way soldiers feared archers or peasants feared tax collectors, in the way people feared plagues, fires, demons. You became an unspoken thing, the shadow behind shadows, the explanation for why a duke suddenly died choking on soup even though no one saw anything suspicious. You were a curse, a walking omen, and nothing spread faster than fear, especially in places where half the population still believed thunder came from angry gods and cats were agents of Satan. Superstition wasn't a side effect, it was the main course. You didn't just kill people, you vanished them. And in a world where everyone needed reasons for everything, assassin was never the first conclusion. It was always something darker. Whispers started. Not about blades or poison, about spells, about powers. You could turn invisible, walk through walls, change faces, summon illness. They said you didn't breathe, that you slipped between cracks in reality, that mirrors shattered when you passed and dogs howled at your scent. It was nonsense, of course, but it worked. People who feared you didn't chase you. They didn't report you. They didn't even say your name aloud. They just crossed themselves, closed their shutters, and told their children not to wander after dusk. You became folklore before you became a corpse. Some towns would claim they saw one. A shadow with glowing eyes, a man with no face, a woman in black who bled ink. But no one ever got proof, because you didn't leave proof. That was the job. Of course, the fear came with drawbacks. Sometimes a village priest would declare that an evil spirit had infiltrated the town. And nothing stirred up a community like a righteous mob with torches and no understanding of subtlety. If they even suspected you were something unnatural, a witch, a revenant, a cursed soul, they'd try to burn you, drown you, dig up your grave just to kill you twice. You had no defense, no way to explain. You couldn't say, actually, I'm just a morally flexible contractor with a sharp knife and commitment issues. That wouldn't help. You didn't get to clarify, you just ran. Being feared kept you alive until it didn't. Because sometimes the fear turned on itself. A baron who once hired you now feared that you'd speak, that you'd come back, that you were watching him through the trees. So he sent men to find you, not to pay you, to silence you. And if he didn't, someone else would. Because if people believed you were more than human, they also believed you could never stop. That once you started killing, it became a hunger. That you needed to be put down before the bloodlust spread. You weren't just the man behind the curtain. You were the curtain, the darkness behind it, and the monster they invented to justify their fear of shadows. It didn't matter what you were. What mattered was what they thought you were. And in the end, that made you more dangerous than you ever wanted to be. Not because of your skill, but because no one ever tried to understand a ghost. They only tried to survive it. Poison always sounded so elegant, so clever, so clean. You slip a drop into a goblet. The target sips, smiles, and dies quietly 5 minutes later with a faint look of surprise. No blood, no mess, just the satisfying knowledge that death can be delivered with subtlety and grace. That was the fantasy. The reality? Poison was messy, unpredictable, and just as likely to kill you as it was your target. To begin with, it wasn't even called poison. Half the time, it was that mushroom that made Cousin Ed scream for 2 days, or the plant the goat wouldn't eat. Apothecaries didn't label things clearly. Most of what you learned came from rumor, trial and error, or watching someone else keel over and thinking, interesting, let's try less next time. There were no measured doses, no standardized formulas. It was herbs soaked in wine, powders hidden in bread, paste smeared on meat pies. You never knew exactly how long it would take to work. Could be 10 minutes, could be 10 hours. Could just give the target a nasty stomachache and an alibi to leave the party early. Sometimes the poison worked perfectly. They drank. They died. No one asked questions. Those were rare. More often, the poison had opinions. The target started coughing, gasping, maybe foaming at the mouth, or vomiting loudly into the soup bowl. Suddenly, everyone was looking around, guards were shouting, and your subtle assassination turned into an open-air theater of horror and suspicion. Not ideal. And then there were the mistakes. You poisoned the wrong cup. You spilled it on yourself. You licked your fingers afterward like an idiot. Or you handed off the tainted food to a servant who ate it without checking. And now they're dead. Your target's suspicious, and the entire castle kitchen is under lockdown. Some poisons required preparation, boiling, grinding, mixing with honey. Except you weren't working in a laboratory. You were working in a damp shed behind an inn with rats and a candle that kept going out. Measuring spoons didn't exist. You guessed. And guessing with poison? That's how you end up as your own cautionary tale. And let's not forget resistance. The rich were paranoid. They had tasters, food testers, rituals. Some lords only ate things that had been tasted, blessed, and juggled by 3 different people. A few even trained themselves on small doses of poison to build immunity. You poisoned the wine, and the lord just smirked at you mid-toast. Now what? And still, you tried. Because poison was quiet. It didn't require climbing walls or sneaking past dogs. It could be done from a distance, a slipped packet, a bribe to a cook, a handshake with residue on the ring. When it worked, it was poetry. When it didn't, it was panic. Eventually, you learned to distrust it. You used it only when you had to, only when escape was guaranteed, only when you had 3 backup plans and no other option. Because the truth was simple. Blades were honest. They didn't hesitate. They didn't care what the target had for lunch. Poison was a gamble, a wager made with your own life. And in this line of work, there were already too many ways to die without drinking your own mistake. You didn't make it into the history books. That's the part no one tells you when they slide the coin pouch across the table. That no matter how high the target ranked, no matter how bloody the coup or quiet the kill, your name wouldn't be written down. Your role wouldn't be recorded. You didn't get remembered. You got erased. Even if you changed the course of a kingdom, ended a war before it began, took out a tyrant, stopped a scandal that would have torn a dynasty apart, none of it would be traced back to you. Because history didn't like assassins. History liked heroes. And heroes gave speeches. You disappeared behind a curtain and never came back. Kings got statues. Generals got songs. You got dirt. No chronicler wanted to include you. No poet wrote verses about the hooded figure who waited in a pantry for 4 nights, then stabbed a duke while he was half asleep and drooling. That wasn't romantic. That wasn't dignified. That was inconvenient. And so it was ignored. Sometimes you got a mention, a footnote, A suspicious line in a dusty scroll. Died under mysterious circumstances. Heart failure. Unfortunate fall from the parapet. No one ever said, a ghost of a man crept through the moonlight and did what no soldier could. Even the people who hired you pretended you didn't exist. That was the whole point, wasn't it? To be the silence between sentences, the gap in the timeline, the event that happened without a cause. And if you died, which eventually you would, there'd be no funeral, no mourning. Your body wouldn't be claimed. If it was found at all, it'd be dumped in a pit with the nameless dead. And that's if you were lucky. Some ended up hanging from castle walls, a warning to others. But even then, no plaque. Just a rotting shape with no story. No one knew what you gave up, what you risked, what it cost you to make someone else's legacy possible. You weren't just unseen in life. You were forgotten in death. And maybe, at first, you told yourself that was noble, that being invisible made you powerful, that being left out of history meant you were the one shaping it. But after a while, that lie curdled. Because being forgotten isn't freedom, it's erasure. And the worst part? You got good at it. So good that even you couldn't remember who you were before the contracts started, before the disguises and the dead drops and the long, cold walks through cities that never knew your name. Your face changed so many times it stopped feeling like yours. Your voice bent to so many accents you couldn't hear your own anymore. You didn't vanish from history. You vanished from yourself. And when you finally sat down, years later, in some half-lit corner of nowhere, too old to climb walls, too tired to run, no one would know what you'd done. No one would care. They'd see a ragged old man with strange eyes and bad habits. Not a former ghost. Not a weapon that once shaped kings. You wouldn't even have a story to tell. Because you gave it away. Piece by piece, blade by blade, until nothing was left but the silence. And history is very good at forgetting silence. The people who hired you weren't brave. They weren't noble. They were cowards with coin. Too afraid to kill their own enemies. Too ambitious to let them live. So they found someone disposable. Someone like you. And for a while, that worked. You took the job. You played your part. You delivered the quiet death, the convenient disappearance, the problem solved without fingerprints or fanfare. And in return, they gave you silver, maybe a nod, and a door that shut quietly behind you. But the smarter ones, the powerful ones, they didn't stop there. Because once the body dropped and the dust settled, they realized something chilling. You now knew too much. You knew who wanted whom dead. You knew motives, secrets, timing. You knew what the world wasn't supposed to know. And that made you a liability. So they did what anyone in their position would do. They cleaned up. Not with apologies. With another contract. A second pouch of silver. This time handed to someone else. Another assassin. Another ghost. Someone who'd been told, he's dangerous. He knows things. Make sure it's clean. You became the loose end. The afterthought. The threat that needed neutralizing. Not because you failed, but because you succeeded. You wouldn't see it coming. You never did. It was a mugging gone wrong. A poisoned cup. A silent blade in a familiar alley. The same tools you used, turned against you by someone who didn't care about your skill, your history, or the lives you'd reshaped. All they cared about was silence. It happened all the time. You'd finish a job, disappear into another town, take a moment to breathe. And then, a flicker, a face watching too closely, a footstep that didn't match the others, a tavern that suddenly felt too quiet. You were being hunted, again. Only this time, you were the job. Some tried to fight back, paranoid assassins who set traps around their beds, who slept with knives in both boots and a bottle of acid by the door. It didn't matter. No one stayed ahead forever. Not when your own clients were the ones writing your death sentence. And what could you do? Confront them? Reveal their secrets? Good luck. They had guards, lawyers, influence. You had rumors and a reputation you weren't even allowed to admit was yours. Worse still, some didn't even hire someone else. They handled it themselves. A poisoned coin, a dagger hidden in a handshake, a goodbye that came with a backstab. They wanted it personal. You were their guilt incarnate, their reminder that power came with consequences. Killing you wasn't just cleanup, it was therapy. The lesson? Never trust the client. Never linger after the job. Never believe a word that follows "you've done well." Because the moment you make their life easier, they start imagining a world where you don't exist. And they always like that version better. You weren't just paid to disappear. You were expected to. And if you didn't vanish fast enough, someone would make sure you did. There was no retirement plan, no little cottage by the lake, no peaceful mornings feeding ducks, no friendly locals who didn't ask too many questions. That was fantasy, the kind of dream you told yourself after your third successful job, when the coins were heavy in your pocket and your hands hadn't started shaking yet. But time made liars of everyone. You didn't get out. Not really. Maybe you stopped taking contracts. Maybe your joints got stiff, or your eyesight dimmed, or your luck just ran out one night and you decided enough was enough. But you didn't go back to a normal life, because there was nothing normal left. You'd spent too long in shadows, too long watching exits, too long counting steps and memorizing voices and sleeping with a blade against your spine. You didn't know how to stop. And even if you did, the world wouldn't let you. There were always questions, always people wondering what you knew, who you'd worked for, who you might talk to. You couldn't write a memoir, couldn't change your name and open a bakery. There were no soft landings, only more running, more hiding. Paranoia wasn't a symptom, it was the last skill you had. You checked every lock 3 times, slept in corners, refused to sit with your back to any door. You watched every room like it was a map, every person like a threat, not because you were still in danger, but because your brain couldn't forget that it used to be true. And maybe it was still true. Maybe someone, somewhere, still wanted you gone. Maybe a lord you crossed a decade ago finally remembered your face. Maybe your last employer decided loose ends were bad luck. Maybe the next mug of ale would be your last. You didn't form attachments. Couldn't. People asked questions. People noticed scars. People got close, and then got curious. You couldn't afford that. Love was a risk. Friendship was exposure. Even kindness felt like a crack in your disguise. So you kept your distance. You became a story people told about a traveler with strange eyes and a quiet step. A guest who never gave a name. Someone who stared too long at shadows and left before dawn. Sometimes you stayed in one place a little too long. Got comfortable. Learned the names of the tavern girls. Smiled at a child. Laughed at something stupid. And then you left. Because staying felt like hope. And hope was a weakness. The worst part? No one chased you anymore. Not because you were safe, because you were forgotten. You'd done your job so well, you'd erased even your relevance. You weren't a threat. You weren't a legend. You were just gone. Like a ripple in water, already smoothed out. And you realized, too late, that the only thing left to kill was time. So you wandered, not as a shadow, not as a myth, just as a tired body full of old bruises and half-remembered sins. You didn't look for redemption. That wasn't for people like you. You looked for quiet, for corners, for days without noise. You found them, sometimes. But even there, even in the stillness, the fear never left. Because there was no final chapter, no grand last job, no one last mission with a dramatic ending. There was only the long, slow fade, the kind where no one notices, the kind where you don't either. You didn't get a last chapter. There was no audience, no final applause, no revelation, just silence, a long, steady unwinding of a life no one remembered you lived. Even if you'd killed a king, even if your blade had ended a war, split a bloodline, or shifted a nation's fate, you still died like anyone else. Quiet, alone, forgotten. Maybe it happened in a field. Maybe it happened in a ditch. Maybe you were lucky enough to be indoors when it came, your back against a wall, your breath shallow, your vision shrinking to a pinprick of flickering candlelight. No one was there to hear your last words. Not that you had any. What would you even say? You didn't leave behind stories. You left behind rumors. The sort people only whispered when the fire burned low. I heard he could kill with a coin. They say she never left footprints. There was one who walked into a fortress and didn't come out, but the Lord still died. You became myth, not the kind with songs, the kind with warnings, and eventually, even those faded. Tales got mixed up. Names were wrong. Locations changed. The clean kills became clumsy. The motives became muddled. Over time, you were less a person and more a shape, a shadow in stories told to scare apprentices and children who played with knives. You'd done your job, too well. No legacy, no trail, no name etched into stone. Just a faint, shrinking echo. A story retold by people who never believed it. You wanted to think it mattered, that what you did shaped something, that removing one man let another rise, that taking one life spared 10 more. But the truth was simpler. You were a function, a tool. History didn't record tools. It recorded outcomes. And you? You were left out of both. In the end, there was only a body. No marker, no visitors, just earth. Maybe a stranger passed by. Maybe they paused, looked down, felt something they couldn't name. Then they kept walking, and the wind covered the trail again. That was your story, and no one read it.